The wind comes off the two rivers like a double-voiced hymn, one current brisk and impatient, the other wide and meditative. Reeds whisper in skeins along the banks, dragonflies stitch blue lightning above slick water, in the distance the light lies on bitumen pools like hammered metal. Here the world learns two ideas at once, that time can be persuaded by ritual, and that space can be conquered by schedule. From this low, hot plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, two names rose that would turn clay to scripture and roads to empire, Babylonian and Assyrian. They were not opposites but temperaments, the south, a patient geometry of canals and law, the north, a disciplined breath of cavalry and decree. Together they taught the Near East how to keep promises with brick and iron. At dawn, mist rises in sheets from irrigation ditches where frogs rehearse the night's last sermon. In the marsh behind a village, a boy leans into a reed boat with a push-pole and learns the secret angles of silt. In the city, a baker's first loaves speak in crusts, a shrine-keeper lifts the shutter of a small god's niche, a woman measures grain into a jar with the practiced gravity of a judge. Over all of it the sky is high and pale, as if somebody has scrubbed it clean for ceremonies. The day will be heated and honest. In its long core, men will move brick stamped with royal names, women will pull patterned cloth taut across looms, scribes will teach young hands to make the wedge that outlives breath. You could begin the tale anywhere, on a palace stair under the shadow of a lamassu, in a courtyard where a terracotta goddess smiles without apology, on a road where dust turns letters brown in a messenger's satchel, but the right place is where the rivers part a little and the land shows its ribs. There the South first learned to argue with flood and wind, levees like clauses, sluices like commas, whole districts written in wet grammar so that grain might ripen and gods might be fed. There the North first learned to iron distance flat, hill forts aligned with constellations of policy, garrisons set like teeth in a jaw that did not forgive. In both, the sun could smell bitumen and wheat, bronze and wool, cedar and sweat. In both, numbers walked the streets with as much authority as men. The South called its central beauty Babylon and set Marduk on a throne inside a temple whose name promised to fuse heaven and earth. People came by river and by road to touch that promise, traders with the Gulf's salt still in their hair, shepherds who could read the wind's handwriting, envoys whose sandals had known the piety of many gates. They found a city squared into meaning, the processional way paved for omens and kings, the Ishtar gates enamel creatures pacing like sentences, the ziggurat rising tier on tier until the horizon arranged itself into obedience. In festival, statues floated on barges while drums rolled like thunder practicing. In ordinary time, the city purred with ledgers and litigations, a machine for making trust audible. The North called its great gaze Ashur, then Kalhu and Nineveh and Duarukin in turn, drawing capitals like bows along the Tigris. Here the palace walls spoke in stone, not glaze, alabaster panels where rivers curled with fish, lion hunts froze into muscular hieroglyphs, and siege towers rolled toward crenellations that would not last the afternoon. In the courts, kings stood like verbs, march, weigh, rebuild, decree. On the roads, relays waited with fresh horses. At the borders, deportees arrived in controlled rivers, carrying their crafts into new soils. A letter left a provincial office and reached the throne in days, riding a logic of stations and fear. North was a discipline that could be felt in the wrist, a rider's check, a scribe's neat column of totals, a general's habit of sleeping with his sandals near. But if you climbed the stair of a southern ziggurat at sunrise and looked north, or stood on a northern terrace at dusk and looked south, you would not have seen enemies. You would have seen variations. The same gods changed accents as they crossed latitudes, Ishtar Inanna putting on war paint or a lover's coal as needed, Shamash measuring mornings into justice, Nabu teaching hands to write until writing taught minds to measure, Enki smiling the quiet smile of engineers. The same months turned their keys in different locks, spring a campaign or a canal dredging, harvest a muster or a festival. Even the omens travelled with a certain courtesy. A halo round the moon meant what it meant whether the king wore a tasseled, oiled beard in Nineveh or a blue-fringed robe in Babylon. Archaeologists, digging with brushes where goats now crop thorn, tell a story with pottery and brick. They find the stamp of Nebuchadnezzar II repeated like a heartbeat in blue, they find the judgment of Sennacherib carved into the very water, they find kuduru stones, boundary markers, that still bear the emblems of gods with the brittle dignity of old treaties. They unroll letters from ash and hear, in polite Akkadian, complaints that could be posted to any modern office wall. The barley shipment is late, the strongman at the ford smiles too much, the shields came back from the smith soft at the rivets. They lift library tablets and hear a king boast that he has learned the art of the scribe, while a real scribe coughs in lamp smoke and copies another column of omens because kings die, and catalogues do not. Dates rise out of the dust like palisades. Circa 1894 to 1595 BCE, Old Babylonian, Hammurabi's lean hands on law and canal, circa 1365 to 1050 BCE, Middle Assyrian, provincial muscle learning the map, 745 to 727, Tiglath-Pileser III inventing the empire one reform at a time, 701. Sennacherib holding Jerusalem's throat in a sentence while his reliefs pin Lachish to a wall forever, 669 c. 631, Ashurbanipal reading by lamplight while Elam burns in his mouth, 612, Nineveh's cedar bones crack and fire bakes archives into immortality, 605 to 562, Nebuchadnezzar builds blue geometry into the air and teaches siege engines patience, 539, Cyrus enters Babylon like a lesson in new manners. The numbers do not care what language you count them in. They ask only that you keep the rhythm steady. And yet the tale is not a drum roll of kings. It is a city's long practice. A widow opening the clay envelope of her wedding contract and finding inside the clause that keeps her safe. A girl in Sippar walking past Shamash temple with chalk on her fingers and a tablet under her arm. A cavalry groom rubbing a horse's neck until the beast breathes slower because order begins in trust. A brickmaker lifting the stamp with the king's name and thinking of reeds for his roof. A priest tasting the night air to see if the wind favors a certain prayer. The civilization's genius lies not only in the glitter of its ceremonies but in the choreography of ordinary competence. Listen for their favored metaphors. Water, disciplined into law. Brick, disciplined into mountain. Numbers, disciplined into sky. A city is a conversation between fear and measurement, an empire between appetite and logistics. The South says, we will ritualize flood until it behaves. The North says, we will schedule distance until it is a servant. Both are right, and both are doomed to be right only for a while. The rivers remember their own minds, men grow proud of their own reflections in glaze and stone. Decline enters not with a trumpet but with a small miscalculation repeated, a governor too drunk and too far, a festival that nobles whisper through, a treaty that leaves an aftertaste of salt. If you want the smell of them, here it is, bitumen like medicinal honey, sesame oil in lamps and pans, cedar resin in beams and beards, new clay sweating under a scribe's palm, baked brick radiating afternoon, sheep grease and bronze polish, date syrup warming in a pot while a child licks a spoon and learns that piety tastes sweet. If you want the sound, chisels in gypsum, reeds hissing when wind shaves their tops, drums teaching feet to agree, the click of a scale pan settling, the soft, dense thud of a battering ram kissing a city gate, the short laugh of a judge when a clause is too clever to fail, the crows caw over a field where a deportee plants pomegranate cuttings and does not look back. And if you want the look, lions pacing in enameled blues that make the air cooler just to behold them, Lamassu with the fifth leg that solves motion like a theorem, a crescent moon catching on a ziggurat's edge, a river ordeal where a man walks into the current and comes out as a verdict, a procession of gods under canopies while the king stands without regalia and hopes for tears when the priest's hand finds his cheek, a palace garden with vines that have learned to climb stairs because a stubborn king forced water uphill and made shade a policy. This is the prologue, the epic shot at golden hour, the camera craning up from the river's glitter to find the stair where a girl pauses with a water jar on her hip and looks toward a gate marched upon by dragons and bulls. From here we dive backward to origins, the first levies and tallies, the ancestors in mud brick who figured out that reeds could be nouns and numbers could be spells. From origins we ascend into artisan glory, glaze and algebra, siegecraft and song. We will tread the terraces of society where ranks arrange themselves like steps toward heaven, and we will step into the echoing courts where kings turn policy into thunder. At last we will stand on the far shore of their time and take inventory of what did not die when the banners did, our hours, our degrees, our habit of writing future obligations into present clay. The rivers move. The story moves with them. On the tumbled plains between their divided lights, the Babylonians and Assyrians build, read, march, decree, they fear and feast, they count and console, they sing the creation of the world as if it were also the creation of a good city budget. Their names, one soft in the mouth, one cutting, are the two hands we will use to lift the past. Grip them. Feel the callus and the glaze. The work begins. Begin where the sea once breathed farther inland and the land answered with reeds. Eridu, they said, the first city, its earliest shrine layered like a memory, circa 5400 to 5000 BCE, a knoll of baked mud rising from marshy hush. Fishermen poled across glassy channels, potters dried vessels on roofs, a small altar gleamed with oil and intention. Whether Eridu deserves the crown or shares it with rivals matters less than the pattern it sketches: people, water, ritual, surplus. A village becomes many houses. Many houses become a temple's obligation. Obligation becomes order and order learns to write. By circa 4000 to 3100 BCE the Uruk period pressed city into capital letters. Uruk's Iana precinct, temple on temple, cone mosaic walls flashing red, white, black, learned how to turn offerings and labor into calendar and pay. Cylinder seals, rolled around wet clay, bound a scene into a circle, a woman before a goddess, a hero seizing a lion, a line of jars balancing on shoulders, contract and myth becoming the same gesture. Bevel rim bowls, cheap and innumerable, fed work crews with standard portions. One bowl equals one ration equals a day of your strength converted into brick. In courtyards, tallies scratched by reed stylus grew fussy, then precise, then grammatical, around circa 3300 to 3200 BCE. Signs that once pictured things became signs that meant words. Cuneiform, wedge signs with edges of law, stepped into history with dusty feet. South of Nippur, Sumerian voices rose first, a river plain language that sang tools and gods with equal tenderness. North and west, Akkadian, an early Semitic, laced consonants taught and carried markets in its pocket. The two tongues shared lanes and marriages, competing and borrowing like neighbors who argue over irrigation and share a wine jar after. From their braid came cities with personalities so strong they crackle on tablets: Uruk, restless and beautiful, courting Inanna, Ur, sea-turned and clever, naming boats as if they were sons, Lagash, severe and reforming under kings who made justice a craft, Umma, ambitious, counting canals as if they were spears, Nippur, neutral and holy, the hinge where Enlil's authority ratified crowns. Upstream, The north found its foothold on a cliff above the Tigris, Ashur, both god and place, a city that stared hard at the water's fast shoulder. At first, circa 2000 to 1800 BCE, the Assyrian story sounded like ledgers. Old Assyrian merchants left Ashur with textiles as fine as persuasion, set up Karam, trade colonies across Anatolia, most famously at Karnish-Nesha, and wrote home from smoky counting rooms. Their tablets, hundreds and hundreds from c. 1950 to 1750 BCE, argue freight charges, winter hazards, interest, and the interest on interest, partnership rules, and the reliable unreliability of snow-clogged passes. Tin from the east met copper from the mountains, and bronze, new muscle, paid for sons' apprenticeships and daughters' dowries. The North's first empire was of weight, not war, of trust under seal, not spears under banners. Between c. 2334 and 2154 BCE, a long arm reached across both halves of the land. Sargon of Akkad, the cupbearer turned avalanche, wove city-states into the first Mesopotamian empire that dared to mean the whole weave. Couriers with clay envelopes ran roads, governors learned obedience as a grammar, the royal daughter in Heduana sang to Inanna in Sumerian lines that still taste of salt and moon. When the dream ebbed, climate hardening, highland raids, too many promises coming due, it left a sediment of technique and appetite, a sense that rule could be consolidated, counted, posted, that messages could move faster than rumor, that the king's shadow could touch pepper and timber beyond his horizon. Climate kept a chair at the council. Around 2200 BCE, what scholars call the 4-2-kilo-year event, dryness leaned harder into the land. Yields fell, fields whitened under the slow creep of salt, canals sulked, nomads tested fences. Cities blinked, staggered, adapted. Amorites filtered in, first as shepherds and hirelings, then as officers and heirs, bringing names that would one day sit on thrones. The South reorganized, the North held its breath and learned new terms for caution. Out of this churn rose new equilibria that looked like origins because they lasted long enough to feel natural. By c. 1894 BCE, a modest river town called Babylon began to find its voice. It would take a century to teach the region to listen. Hammurabi, art circa 1792 to 1750 BCE, small of footprint and large of patience, used droughts, rivalries, and the leverage of canals to restring the south. He wrote letters like nets, set judges like stones in a river, and cut waterways that served both barley and troops. The diorite monument that bears his name, the Law Code, though it reads as much like curated judgments and royal posture, is the visible edge of a deeper origin, the wager that life can be regular if people agree to believe the same tablets. In the prologue, a god hands him a rod and ring, in the clauses, a builder pays for the house that fell. Heaven blesses, earth enforces. In the north, a century earlier, Shamshi-Adad c. 1808 to 1776 BCE, had offered his own origin story, sees Ashur, knit a kingdom on the middle Tigris, write brisk advice to sons who preferred sleep to scouts. For a blink, an itinerant throne taught the uplands to speak curriculum, fortify here, flatter there, punish quickly but not sloppily, never trust a friendly frontier. When he died, the fabric loosened and the South's long hand, Hammurabi again, intervened. But the habit remained, the Syria would be a school for governing at distance, where the exam recurred every spring. Under the Kassites, circa 1595 to 1155 BCE, Babylon learned dynastic patience, less ablaze than a hearth. Kuduru boundary stones stood up in fields like polite curses, property lines anchored by divine emblems, Marduk's spade, Adad's forked lightning, Sin's crescent, text and theology making dirt legal. Families, temples, and palaces tested each other's strength in cycles of endowment and reform. Scribal houses copied master texts and produced sons who could make a market obey with a paragraph. Stability was an origin too, one that left thick layers of everyday tablets, loans, leases, adoptions, divorces, hires. A civilization writes itself into being. Sometimes the writing looks like a hymn, often it looks like rent. The Middle Assyrians, circa 1365 to 1050 BCE, answered with perimeter and province. Ashurbanipal I greeted Egypt's pharaoh as a peer, Adad-nirari I, Shalmaneser I, and Tukulti-Ninurta I pushed borders until maps squeaked. Tukulti-Ninurta briefly captured Babylon, circa 1225 BCE, and did the unthinkable. He dragged its gods north, an administrative act disguised as impiety or the reverse. He built a new capital opposite Ashur as if to argue with his own city. If origin means the template that later ages will copy, Middle Assyria qualifies: governors with ranges and rations, deportations used to break coalitions and sow loyalty, standing garrisons as punctuation along the road. The Late Bronze Age cracked around c. 1200 BCE. Hatti's citadels dimmed. Ugarit's last courier carried a clay letter into fire. Sea peoples hammered coasts. Aramean tribes threaded the seam between field and desert. Assyria breathed in, then out. Babylon suffered Elamite hands and internal frailty. Aramaic, a quick, flexible script on papyrus and skin, rode caravan rhythms and whispered itself into official corridors. Out of the wreckage came new starts that felt like old instincts remembering themselves: count, relay, restore, record. Below the timetables and treaties, other origins were older still. Agriculture was an argument with salt and timing. The Euphrates, long and sometimes lazy, needed coaxing and patience. The Tigris, quick and impetuous, needed respect and rehearsal. In the south, barley became the loyal crop of brackish fields. Date palms were households in a trunk: fruit, shade, rope, timber, syrup, sugar. Farmers learned to flush salts, to fallow, to rotate, to read the thin green grammar of a shoot. In the north, a little more rain and a little more slope favored wheat and vines. Hills taught terraces and prudence. Levees and sluices were laws written in mud. Failure, breach, silt choke, neglect was a lawsuit as clear as a collapsed bank. Boats were memory and method. In the marshes, reed bundles curved into hulls and skated over water with that peculiar marsh silence. On canals, flat-bottomed barges moved grain like slow thunder. On the lower Euphrates and the Gulf, deep-bellied craft stitched Dilmun, Bahrain, and Magan, Oman, to the delta, copper glinting under mats, timbers smelling of resin and salt. Donkeys, patient, strong, unromantic, made caravans practical. Later, on open steppes, horse law from Hurrian and Indo-Iranian neighbors would refit speed into policy. But at the beginning, it is the slow animal, the shallow draft, the profound idea. Distance can be made obedient. The workshop is an origin you can hold. A bead of lapis drilled by sand and time, a pendant in gold granulation so fine that daylight hesitates on its edge, a bronze adze whose socket grips the haft like a firm correction, a bread stamp that turns dough into rosettes and law into lunch, a terracotta plaque of a nursing goddess slid into a wall near the hearth, a private theology where milk and mercy rhyme. The first elegance is practical. Seals do not just sign, they tell the world what kind of world it should be: orderly, witnessed, watched by a god perched in the register's top line. Religion begins as housekeeping for the invisible and matures into urbanism. In the south, the god statue, wood clothed in gold, mouth opened by ritual, lives like a dignitary, bathed, fed, sung to at the right hours, paraded on high days. The temple is a payroll before it is a mystery school, fields to manage, workshops to supply, singers to stipend, grain to loan at interest that makes both heaven and treasurers smile. In the north, the same structure acquires a marching rhythm, Asher as a standard, Ishtar as the war's complicated conscience, oracles at Arbela answering the king's precise and anxious questions, shall I go against the city of X this month? With a confidence both divine and administrative. Origins of piety are also origins of management. Myth pulls the past into a shape that looks like meaning. In Enma Eli, the world begins in mingled waters, Apsu, sweet, Tiamat, salt, then argument, then war, then the enthronement of Marduk, who splits the dragon and suspends the halves as sky and sea, fixes stars into a legal calendar, and creates humans so that gods may be free of scut work. It is cosmology and civics at once. Victory over chaos becomes the right to tax, the god's sovereignty is the city's explanation for processions and fines. In Atrahasis and in the flood tablet woven into Gilgamesh, the deluge cleans the human slate because we are noisy and numerous. One clever man, warned, builds a boat with exact measures, smears it with bitumen that smells like Mesopotamia itself, and studies birds the way a harbor master studies weather. When the boat grounds and the smoke of sacrifice twists upward, the lesson is double: build well, keep the gods on your side, and remember that water can both feed and erase you. Kingship, too, wears myth as a uniform. The Sumerian king list arranges early history into dynastic stanzas that move like liturgy. Kingship descends from heaven, it rests in a city for a time, it moves on. Reigns stretch into thousands of years in the early verses, then contract into human lengths as history warms. The point is not accuracy, the point is legitimacy's migration, the idea that rule is a sacred errand that visits towns according to a schedule older than political convenience. Later kings, Hammurabi, Tukulti-Ninurta, Sennacherib, Nebuchadnezzar, step into this river and let it carry them while they paddle furiously in real canals, negotiating with priests whose gods sign pay orders and with generals whose rams split real gates. Writing domesticated uncertainty. Early tablets are inventory, barley, oil, sheep, beer, accounts that attached promises to containers. But once a city knows it can trap a day in clay, it traps more. Letters, tell my brother the silver is late. Court records, the witness has seen the boundary stone since childhood. Hymns, medical recipes, omen series. The tablet house, Idubba, becomes a civic organ. Boys, and a few girls, learn the sign lists, copy Sumerian proverbs in an Akkadian world, graduate to contracts and, the fortunate, to literature. An Amanu or scholar advises the king not because he flatters but because he remembers, eclipses logged for generations, comets with their seasons, livers with their patterns, he knows which ritual fits which terror, which clause fits which crime. This is an origin of a different sort, bureaucracy braided to conscience. Salinization is the oldest footnote in the South's prosperity. Irrigation that feeds for a century will poison if you forget to flush. Barley forgives more than wheat but not indefinitely. Farmers, clever as always, answer with fallows, changing water timings, salt-tolerant plots, palaces, competent or not, answer with canal maintenance and ordering the dredging crews out on the right day with the right rations. When a dynasty grows pious about festivals but forgets mud, fields mutiny. When a king remembers mud, gods smile without incense. That, too, is origin, the knowledge that a civilization cannot pray its way past chemistry. North and South learned each other's tricks early. Assyrian merchants prayed at southern shrines and wrote contracts in southern styles. Babylonian kings hired northern officers and adopted the elegant cruelty of deportation when it served a humane end, ending rebellions with movement rather than massacre, planting talents where taxes were needed. Artifacts betray the cross-pollination, a southern seal carved with a northern god, a northern relief borrowing a southern river plant as border, hymn tunes migrating on the lips of hired singers. The origin here is not purity but mixture, the recipe written on clay and edited over centuries by need. Dates to hang the mind on, circa 5400 to 5000 BCE, Eridu's earliest temple layers, shrine, rebuild again, circa 3500 to 3100, Uruk's explosive growth, cone mosaics, bevel rim bowls, protocuneiform, circa 2334 to 2154, Akkad's experiment in unity, Sargon, Naram Sin crowned with horned helmet, empire drunk on success, c. 2100 to 2000, your Threes accounting miracle, Ulgies runners, brick after brick stamped with calm arrogance, circa 1950 to 1750, old Assyrian trade letters, tin and textiles chewing distance in careful bites, circa 1894 to 1595, old Babylonian, Hammurabi's canals and clauses, circa 1365 to 1050, Middle Assyrian, provincialization as art, c. 1200, the hinge, crack, drift, new scripts on cheaper materials, c. 911 to 609, Neo-Assyrian, iron schedule, bureaucratic hunger, c. 626 to 539, Neo-Babylonian, restoration as ideology, blue brick teaching or, 539, Persia breathes new air into old rooms and keeps the calendar because it works. Each date is a brick. Together they hold. If you want to watch an origin happen, look at a canal opening in first light. Workers with wicker baskets pass a rhythm down a human chain, silt rising and falling in arcs like birds. A foreman carries an oiled stick that means both pay and pain. A priest speaks a formula that has been mended and recopied for centuries, words pat the water into cooperation. The gate creaks. A brown tongue of flow slides into a thirsting branch. A boy yells, the men laugh, the foreman pretends not to. Somewhere, kilometers away, a field darkens, and a woman straightens her back and thinks of bread with date syrup and wonders if this year will be a year of figs or of onions. That, too, is origin, not the king's decision, not the god's sign, but the hinge between them where labor and hope touch mud and make it behave. And if you prefer the palace view, stand with Shamshi-Adad over a map scratched on a board. He places pebbles for cities, strings for roads, a small cup for a river crossing. He instructs a son to greet ambassadors properly, to punish a lazy captain, to write home with more numbers and fewer excuses. The son nods and forgets. The father writes again. An origin of empire is a father's persistence against a son's temperament. A state is partly a family romance written in the ink of other people's lives. Origins also hide in negative space, in what did not exist yet. No coins, so silver by weight must be honest and scales must be watched. No alphabet, not yet in the South, so scribal class is a narrow door and memory a guild. No iron, then iron, so war and plough share a new hardness. No horse, then horse, so the horizon speed changes policy speed. Every debut recasts the past. When Aramaic script climbs offices, archives feel lighter. When cavalry prove themselves more adaptable than chariots, parade grounds look old-fashioned. When a king discovers that stamping his name on every brick makes even his absence eloquent, architecture becomes autobiography. What did the land feel like at the beginning? Winter, a rare gentleness, rainly shawls, chilly mornings that make bitumen smell clean. Spring, bright and wet, the rivers fat and argumentative. Summer, a white anvil, the brickyards ringing with the sound of drying. Autumn, a copper moderation, dates sticky, figs splitting, threshing floors busy with footprints and laughter. Vultures haggled over their sky rights, jackals loped where walls would one day daunt them, lions paced the riverine edges until royal hunts pushed them into stylized immortality. In the marshes, pigs rooted and fish flicked; in the highlands, goats stitched their way up; in the orchard belts, bees kept their educated conversations. Origins are sensory before they are political. And what did the people call themselves? Many names: Sumerians, Akkadians, Sabarians, Amorites, Kassites, Hurrians, Arameans, sometimes neighbors, sometimes rivals, sometimes family. The city answered to a god's name in public and to a quarter's nickname in private. A woman from Lagash married a man from Umma, a boy from Asher apprenticed in Karnish and came back with a scarf and an accent, a deportee from Hamath planted vines by the Zab and taught a song that made the governor's wife cry in a language she did not know. The origin is plural, the labels Mesopotamian is our convenience for their overlaps. Finally, the paradox that begins every enduring civilization: they built for the next festival and for the next century at once. A levee repaired for this flood became a boundary your grandson would swear by. A hymn written for tonight's moon became school text for a millennium. A governor's letter about soft rivets hardened into evidence of how iron entered daily life. A widow's clay envelope, broken before 3 board elders, became the proof we hold that law can be practical and tender in the same clause. Origins are modest when they happen. They look like errands. Only later do they glow. Begin with a brick that shines. In Babylon the common mud of the plain learned alchemy, sifted, tempered, fired, then washed in glaze the color of cool evening. Along the processional way lions paced in enamel blues and ambers, each manet a geometry of heat, each pour a measured promise that festivals would arrive on time. The Ishtar gate closed behind kings like a page turned with ceremony. Above, bulls and serpent dragons, aurochs and mu, he marched, a heraldry of power that even dust respected. Nearby, Temenonki, that house of the foundation of heaven and earth, shouldered the sky, tier on tier, stairs turned prayer into altitude. Whether it climbed 7 terraces or memory exaggerates, its shadow taught afternoons to behave. In the north, stone remembered the chisel. At Kalhu, Nimrud, Duarukin, Khorsabad, and Nineveh, alabaster panels spoke in a carved present tense, rivers with reeds so particular you could name them, gardens where imported trees learned new names, hunts where lions die beautifully so that kings can practice composure. Colossal Lamassu stood at gates with 5 legs to solve the problem of motion, still when faced, walking when passed. A visitor felt both reassured and judged. Cedar beams crossed ceilings like thundercourt horizontal, bronze bands clasped doors that opened onto courtyards squared for spectacle. Trade made both realms breathe beyond their borders. Barges moved grain along canals with the slow certainty of seasons. Deep-bellied boats slid down the Euphrates into the Gulf, stitched by bitumen, carrying woolen textiles and receiving copper, pearls, and frankincense. Up the caravan roads came tin from the east to marry with copper into bronze. Later, iron rode in as ore and as rumor and stayed as policy. From Dilmun, Bahrain, and Magan, Oman, the smell of resin and salt; from the Levant cedar and purple; from Anatolia silver and horses; from far Badakhshana blue so dense, lapis, that night itself seemed ground into beads. Donkeys told distance at 3 kilometers an hour. By the first millennium BCE, camels learned roads too, desert ships folding dunes into itinerary. Every arrival wore a seal, a cylinder rolled over wet clay, leaving scenes of prayer and bargain, hunt and blessing, a signature that was also a story. Workshops became orchestras of materials. Bronzesmiths hammered cauldrons until the metal sang at the rim. Later ironsmiths teased carbon into edge and resilience. Gold workers fused grains of metal into fine constellations, granulation so delicate that light hesitated on it. Lapidaries drilled carnelian with sand, and patience, glass, still young, appeared as beads, and small vessels, a captured translucence. In the potter's quarter, wheels turned with a pulse like breath, storage jars kept the year's confidence, fine bowls took a lip so exact that a reader of law might envy it. Terracotta plaques, domestic theology, looked after kitchens, a nursing goddess for milk and infancy, a hero grappling with chaos to keep the stew from burning. Architecture moved from proud improvisation to plan. Babylon laid out broad avenues where processions could think, moats and double walls made reflections part of defense, residential lanes turned inward toward courtyards cool with shade, a cistern at the center holding sky in a circle. Assyrian capitals were cities drawn with measuring cords and enforced with inspections, palace platforms as stages, parade grounds as arguments, new orchards planted in lines straight as policy. Urban drains ran beneath the triumph, gutters and culverts gave rain somewhere civilized to go. Agriculture, always the empire under the empire, refined its arithmetic. In the south, barley tolerated brackish soil and returned loyalty, date palms were multipurpose households, fruit, sugar, rope, timber, syrup, shade. Sesame lent its oil to lamps and pans, an edible light. In the north, wheat preferred kinder rain, vines climbed hills that had learned terracing. Rope-stretched survey lines decided fields, weirs and sluices responded to a calendar of dredging and repair, corvée crews rotated by lot and list, their rations weighed out in measures that made appetite predictable. A bad year could be outlived by schedule alone, a good year fed the gods generously and creditors adequately, which is the social definition of peace. Count what they counted. Weights and measures lived in hands, the shekel and the mina, the talent for grand arithmetic, capacity jars with marks that forgave neither cheat nor mistake. Mathematics walked on a sexagesimal skeleton. 60 divided the circle, the hour, the ledger column, place value let scribes whisper very large and very small numbers with calm confidence. Tables, reciprocals, squares, cube roots, were copied until wrists ached. Problems set by teachers asked how many bricks to face a wall, how deep to dig a canal, how fast a boat fought current. Out of such practical questions came an art of number that could predict an eclipse. NUL. A pin, the constellation lists, set the night into order. The Venus tablet remembered the bright wanderers' risings and disappearings. Enma Anu Enlil compiled omens from sky to kingship, a bureaucracy of stars. Priests watched from rooftops, scholars wrote on clay, time learned to be legible. Medicine braided recipe and ritual into care. Tablets list poultices and syrups, licorice, myrrh, beer, milk, plant resins, crushed minerals, applied with instructions as practical as any modern label. Case notices begin, if a man's temples throb and his tongue is heavy, and proceed with steps, some herbs, some incantations, the demon of fever coaxed out like a tenant behind on rent. Bones were set, wounds washed with wine or brine, deliveries coached by midwives who knew both positions and prayers. An Ipu, exorcist, and an Asu, physician, might disagree in theory and cooperate in practice. Results were tracked with the same stubborn attention that weighed barley. The library was a machine for surviving fire. In Nineveh, Ashurbanipal gathered epics, rituals, diagnostics, grammars, and lexica, tens of thousands of tablets, each labeled with series, number, an opening line, master copy and owner copy carefully noted. Clay, fire's friend as much as its victim, baked into preservation when roofs fell. The Epic of Gilgamesh breathed here, copied and recopied, a king who searched for meaning in cedar forests and flood stories and found limits instead, a friendship that taught him mortality's taste. Alongside the era epic, the Theodicy, wisdom literature that could brook a complaint without banishing it. Babylonian scholars in temple schools curated their own orchards of text, scribal families copied dictionaries and omen lists, a city's second memory ticked in wedge strokes, calm as rain. Music threaded the spaces between law and war. Harps and lyres tuned for praise and for wine, drums teaching feet to agree, reed pipes lifting evenings out of heat. A bull-headed lyre remembered earlier dynasties, new instruments learned court etiquette and tavern mischief. The royal game of yore, by other names in later ages, marched counters across 30 squares, luck and skill in a small democracy where princes and potters could both win. Leisure is a civilization's boon and boast. Afternoons that can afford to be aimless are a sign of order. Textiles, especially wool, turned sheep into currency. Fullers stomped and rinsed, spinners turned raw fleece into twist, weavers counted warp and weft with a confidence that flows down from a teacher's hands to a student's eyes. Dyers coaxed colors from plants and murex shells, pattern borders told the quarter and guild before the owner spoke. In markets, folded cloth piled like weather, in contracts, textiles moved like silver. Northern halls added furniture carved and inlaid with ivory, Phoenician workshops sending rosettes and palmettes to frame Assyrian pride. Water obeyed the stubborn. Sennacherib, impatient with Nineveh's thirst, netted fast springs and made them walk, canals carried obedience across kilometers, at Jerwan a stone aqueduct strode a valley, its wedge stones still whispering gradient and will. Water-lifting devices enter inscriptions, spirals and screws in the imaginations of later engineers, perhaps chain and bucket in practice, machines that turned gardens vertical. Terraces stepped shade down like a benediction. Whether the fabled hanging garden stood by the Euphrates under Nebuchadnezzar or by the Kosar under Sennacherib, the idea itself, horticulture as theatre and technology, was a Mesopotamian confidence. Heat can be made to cool if you know its mathematics. War's workshops were also crafts. Composite bows laminated wood, horn, and sinew into range and penetration, iron heads tipped arrows, scale armor flashed in files like fish, shields were ribbed, then bossed, chariots, aristocrats of an earlier battlefield, gave way to cavalry taught discipline well enough to replace wheels with hooves. Siegecraft refined its catalogue, battering rams on wheeled frames, their noses sheathed in iron, towers with squared windows for archers, ramps poured against walls, sapping beneath hide soaked in water. Engineers counted baskets of fill, degrees of slope, lengths of timbers, quartermasters counted rations and nails. The moment of impact was art only because the rehearsal was science. Festivals were constitutions set to music. In Nisan, the Aktu made the city begin again, God statues visited one another by barge, Enma Eli was recited as if creation needed annual maintenance, the king grasped Marduk's hand and then stood, unadorned, to receive the high priest's slap. Tears were an omen of favor, humility was policy. Feasting followed, public and private. Amnesties were sometimes declared, grievances dissolved in beer foam or hardened for the courts tomorrow. In Assyria, oracles spoke with the clarity kings craved, Ishtar of Arbela answering precise questions with precise endorsements, a bureaucracy of divination aligning with a bureaucracy of supply. Temples were banks with hymns. Offerings came in as grain and left as loans, silver rested in chests and moved out with interest, fields under divine ownership produced for both heaven and payroll. The Mispai, mouth-opening, right turned statues into living presences, from then on they had morning routines and evening moods. Priests kept accounts as carefully as mysteries, lamentation singers timed grief, exorcists negotiated with invisible trespassers, citing precedent like litigators, diviners filed reports. Palace and temple bargained perpetually, who owns which fields, who funds which singers, who audits which storerooms. When the arrangement worked, prosperity felt inevitable. When it didn't, gods got the blame and the king got anxious. Domestic life practiced a quieter elegance. Inward-facing houses cupped shade, a palmwood door pivoted on bitumen-slicked stone, the courtyard smelled of onion and lamb, bread cooled on a reed mat stamped with a rosette. Cosmetics were practical and ceremonial, coal cut glare and envy, oil soothed skin and signaled status. Jewelry guarded while it adorned, amulets in crescents and rosettes, seals worn at the wrist as identification and charm. At night, roofs became living rooms, families counted stars because their ancestors had taught them the names. A ghost could be a legal person, libations kept the dead from growing resentful, memory was a duty with a calendar. Bankers learned to speak clay. In late Babylon the house of Egibai, and others like it, made credit and lease a perfected craft, orchards rented by clause, silver advanced at interest calibrated to crop and risk, slaves leased by skill, partnerships formed and dissolved like constellations in season. Each tablet was sealed twice, once by law, once by custom. Each envelope preserved the inner text as if the city expected arguments and enjoyed settling them. Commerce is bureaucracy with a heartbeat. Scholarship turned even superstition into discipline. Omen compendia did for accident what law did for conflict, gave it a syntax. If the moon is crowned by a halo, if a sheep's liver shows a notch on the caudate lobe, if a house wall sweats, each antecedent marched with its consequence, each consequence with its remedy. The point was less to banish fear than to domesticate it, to make the future negotiable, to give policy a shape that gods might sign. In this, Babylonia and Assyria were twins. The south rationalized wonder into tables, the north operationalized it into orders. Clothing wrote status in texture. Babylon favored patterned wool and fine linen, fringes that later law codes and prayers would remember. Assyria layered tunics and tassels beneath glittering armor, belts declaring office as clearly as seals. Beards were geometry, hair was argument. Smell was part of style, date syrup and cedar resin, sesame oil and bitumen, incense that told the nose it was near a god or a king. Even silence was an art. In a library room, a scribe copied the opening line of a series, incipit, series number, owner copy, then pressed his nail into the margin to mark a correction he would check with the master. In a garden at dusk, water talked down steps with a voice trained by engineers. In a court, a judge let the quiet lengthen until a witness corrected himself. In a workshop, a bowyer listened for the creak that meant the glue had cured. Flourishing is often the sound of competence refusing to brag. If you need dates to hang this abundance on, take these as pegs. See the 7th century BCE, Sennacherib's aqueducts and Nineveh's terraced plantings, c. 669, c. 631, Ashurbanipal's library, a clay cosmos, 605 to 562, Nebuchadnezzar II's blue geometry, the processional way and restorations named like prayers, throughout the first millennium, sexagesimal astronomy perfected into ephemerides and zigzag functions that could predict a planet's future as if it were a tax payment coming due. Around and under these, artisans, farmers, midwives, surveyors, accountants, hands and eyes that made greatness ordinary. So the flourishing looked and tasted and counted like this: glaze that cooled the eye, stone that moved without moving, gardens that climbed, canals that obeyed, numbers that persuaded the sky to keep appointments, libraries that taught fire to preserve, festivals that humiliated power into safety, law that wrapped property in divine emblems, a trade web that smelled of resin and sea. South called it Marduk's favor, North called it Asher's strength. Both were right, for a while. Society stacked itself like a ziggurat, wide base of hands and harvest, middle terraces of craft, credit, and calculation, a windy summit where kings learned to be alone. The climb between levels was possible, but steep. In Babylonia the law knew three primary names: Olam, full citizen; Muknam, dependent commoner; Wardam, slave, and adjusted penalties and protections accordingly. In life, the borders blurred. A slave could run a shop on the side, purchase freedom, marry, and father free children. A Muknam might lease a date orchard and, through good floods and better contracts, step upward into civic weight. An Olam, caught by debt or a vindictive lawsuit, might discover the taste of orders given by someone else. The clay could be precise. The street could be generous. A house told you everything. Most were inward-looking, brick walls to the street, rooms around a courtyard where light, air, and gossip pooled. The threshold stone remembered generations of sandals. Against a cool wall, a cistern held a circle of sky. Kitchen smelled of onion and lamb, a reed map bore the rosette mark of a bread stamp. On a shelf, a terracotta goddess lifted her breasts with steady, domestic blessing. The oldest man signed tablets, but contracts from Sippar and elsewhere show women owning plots, lending silver, hiring labor, suing and being sued. The dowry, Eriktu, traveled with a woman into marriage and, crucially, back out if the union failed or death intruded. Bride price, Teratu, compensated the bride's family. Adoption deed secured heirs for the childless, promising, "He shall bury me and mourn me," a sentence half legal, half tender. A widow could open her marriage envelope, a clay wrap around a clay tablet, both sealed, before elders in a temple court and find inside the clause that kept her safe. The city honored that clause as if a small god lived in the words. Education began with reed and clay. The Adaba, tablet house, was part school, part guild hall, part factory of memory. Boys, and some gifted girls, copied sign lists until wrists ached: wood, fish, birds, stones, gods, kings, measures, months. They moved from Sumerian proverbs, the old language kept like a sacred instrument, to Akkadian compositions, from simple tallies to contracts, oaths, and, if fortunate, literature. A good scribe could find work anywhere: temple storerooms, palace archives, market courts, army musters. The best, Uman, became court intellectuals, keepers of omen series and star tables, advisors who mixed astronomy with politics. A king could rule with spears, he governed with scribes. In Assyria, titles clinked like iron. The Turtnu commanded when the king did not. The Rab-Ari, a high eunuch, moved within the palace with frightening latitude. The BL party governed provinces, balancing harvest, tribute, roads, and military quotas. Eunuchs, cut from family trees, often grew the deepest roots in office. Their loyalty had no heirs to compete with it. Queens were treasurers and patrons. Queen mothers could be weather systems. Nakie, Zakutu, mother of Esarhaddon, wrote decrees that magnates obeyed with a son's diligence. Beneath the top tier, the Ilku service, land for duty, turned fields into regiments. Spring brought omens, then orders. The state was a schedule. Law walked outdoors. Kuduru stones, Kassite Babylonian boundary markers, rose in fields with carved emblems of gods: Marduk's spade, Sin's crescent, Adad's forked bolt, Ishtar's star. The message was elegant: the divine watched titles and tax exemptions as surely as prayers. In city courts, judges listened under awnings, witnesses called, envelopes broken, seals examined against seal lists, copies compared. When evidence tangled, ordeal untied the knot, the river decided, swallowing the guilty, bearing up the vindicated. Theft had tariffs, injury had prices, false testimony had teeth. And mercy had procedures, remissions at festivals, debt holidays in crisis years, provisions for widows and war returnees. Justice was a craft, taught and supervised. Priests kept accounts and weather both. Religion braided home, city, and crown into one cord. At home, clay plaques watched thresholds, libations marked the Kisbam day, when the living fed the hungry dead with beer and bread, names spoken so memory would not crack. In the city, temples dominated skyline and payroll. The god statue was not symbol but resident, its mouth ritually opened, Miss Pie, its mornings bathed, its garments changed by season or parade, its diet ion measured, bread, beer, incense, a little meat. Priests, Angu, audited offerings and wages, lamentation singers, Kalu, performed the calendar's dark music, exorcists, Ipu, addressed sickness and haunting in the tone of legal injunctions, diviners, Ba with macronar, red livers and smoke, turning accident into counsel, physicians, Asu, mixed syrups and poultices from recipes that took superstition seriously but did not ignore symptoms. A temple was a bank that prayed. Pantheons overlapped, accents shifting with latitude. In Babylon, Marduk rose to a chair he did not always own, his dragon snake moo curling along the Ishtar gate's enamel. Nabu, beloved of scribes at Borsippa, made literacy a devotional act. Shamash, the square god of the sun, shone law into afternoons. Sin-cut months, Adad barged in with storm, Enki smiled from sweet waters under everything, patron of craftsmen and cunning. Ishtar Tinana moved in both capitals with the confidence of war and love twinned, her oracles in Assyria answered kings as if policy were a liturgy. Ninurta guarded fields, Nergal and Ereshkigal managed the unwarm republic below. In Assyria, Ashur's name hovered like a standard seen from every field, theology made empire a sacrament. Yet local flavors persisted. Ishtar of Arbela had a voice kings trusted more than they trusted sleep, Nabu of Kalhu anchored scholarly pride, gods traveled by road like ambassadors. The year staged meanings on cue. In Nisan, Aktu made Babylon begin again, Marduk left his shrine, visited the city, accepted homage. Enma Eli, the creation, was recited as if the cosmos required annual maintenance, the king grasped the god's hand, then stood stripped of regalia to be slapped by the high priest. Tes signaled acceptance. Humility, even if staged, made power safer. Elsewhere, eclipses were national anxieties, substitute kings sat briefly to soak doom while the true king hid in ritual time, then re-emerged when the sky calmed. In Assyria, written oracles affirmed campaigns, reproved delay, named enemies as if the goddess had read the mail. Festivals spread amnesties and sharpened grievances, the morning after was always busy for clerks. Slavery was everywhere and not the same everywhere. Debt, punishment, birth, and war fed the condition, manumission softened it at the edges. Contracts show slaves managing shops, leasing themselves out by skill, a miller, weaver, scribe's assistant, marrying free, purchasing children's futures clause by clause. Names in tablets read "my former slave" with a peculiar warmth. In Assyria, mass deportations, policy as horticulture, ripped people from rebellious soils and planted them in loyal fields. Cruel. Efficient. Mixed communities grew where empire forced them, talents took root where taxes needed them, grandchildren called the new ground home. In Babylon, the same technique wore a softer accent, less raising, more repotting. Either way, the social fabric changed its weave. Gender wrote itself into law and practice with nuance. Natu priestesses in Sippar and elsewhere, women dedicated to Shamash, managed estates, lent silver, adopted heirs, and wrote letters with cool competence. Marriage and sex rules vary by precinct, but power did not shun their cloisters. Ordinary women in markets haggled craftily, in workshops they supervised weaving floors, in taverns, often a female trade, they served beer through straws from large jars and filtered rumor into information. Divorce documents could protect wives or return dowries with penalties for at-fault husbands. In Assyria, queens endowed shrines, issued orders, financed hunts, the queen mother, when formidable, made and unmade days. Beauty had a grammar, coal against glare and gossip, oil in hair, fringes on garments that signaled house and quarter. Food and drink were civics at the table. Barley bread and flat cakes, stews of lamb and leek glossed with date syrup, fish salted or fresh from the marsh, sesame oil in lamps and pans, an edible light, beer a thick, nutritious, sipped through straws to dodge the floating grains, wine more common in the north, where vines learned to climb terraces and keep secrets. Banquets were politics set to cutlery. Assyrian inscriptions brag of feedings measured by herds and days. Babylonian feasts processed piety into community, sharing meat as if abundance were a policy. In lean years, ration lists became scriptures of survival. Clothing spoke fluent status. In Babylon, fine wool and linen made civic poetry, borders patterned by guild and neighborhood, fringes remembered by later law. In Assyria, layered tunics and tassels under armor, belts that said office before the mouth did, helmets crested with intimidating geometry, beards oiled and braided into arguments for order. Jewelry protected while it adorned, amulets in crescents and rosettes, seals worn at the wrist, signature and charm at once. Smell mattered, cedar resin, imported rain, sesame, home, bitumen, the city's glue, incense, a god is near, date syrup, a god is pleased. The city's eye sat at its gates. Watchmen counted strangers, heralds counted notices, the king's eye, inspector without warning, counted officials who counted badly. Spies traveled as merchants, and merchants reported like spies. Relay stations lined the royal roads at a day's ride, horses ate distance, letters in leather satchels grew tired at the corners. Procedures lived there, taxes posted, oaths taken, punishments performed. A debtor who stood under the arch to swear bound himself to the city's memory, a debtor who slipped through at dusk tried to outrun it. Religion held dissent within liturgy. The Babylonian theodicy dares a complaint, the pious suffer, the wicked prosper. Its answer is not neat. Job in another tradition would recognize the argument's courage. Laments for fallen cities, then later, others, gave grief a meter and a season. Divination's obsession with if X then Y taught a habit of classification so rigorous it became a science by accident. Even when the gods were the authors of consequence, the scribes compiled, compared, corrected. A prophecy that failed this month could be filed for next century's war. Death was administration, too. Bodies often went under house floors, clan held close, names recited on schedule, offerings poured through clay tubes, wrong dead summoned by exorcists to hear settlements. The underworld did not burn, it hungered. Ereshkigal ruled, Nergal visited badly and stayed, Inanna descended, learned a price for power, ascended with conditions attached. Ghosts, Itemu, were legal entities in the sense that they could ruin your week, remedies were petitions, fumigations, substitutions, scoldings completed with ritual closure. Memory was the city's duty to the past, forgetting was malpractice. Leisure made dignity visible. Game boards, 30 squares and rules that move between skill and luck, slid pebbles and carved counters under hands of princes and dockhands alike. Musicians rated streets and palaces by different criteria. Tavern songs survived where hymns did not. Lullabies outlived their singers because children caught them. Even jokes made it to clay, a pupil's complaint about a strict master, a proverb about the man who borrowed a donkey and returned excuses, a sharp dialogue where a servant grants and then deflates every wish, irony as therapy. Foreigners reskinned the city without peeling it. Hurrians brought horse law that refit chariotry into science, Arameans carried a script that made writing faster and cheaper, Phoenicians combined lumber and letters into influence, Egyptians sent faience glints and lotus motifs that looked like imported weather, Elam taught iconography's Eastern accent, Medes, Cimmerians, Scythians flickered at the stepp's edge, teaching fear to be prudent. The city wore these gifts like jewelry, noticeable, negotiable, not always comfortable. Accents in markets became as common as weights on scales. Administration was a second religion. Assyrian provinces kept granary and garrison in paired health, inspections were sacrament, lists, litany. Babylonian temples balanced ledgers with piety, palaces bargained with priesthoods for fields and festivals, endowments and exemptions. The best reigns were truces with competent clauses. The worst were feuds disguised as theology. Either way, scribes wrote everything down as if future courts were more frightening than current kings. They were right. Crimes had choreography. Thieves paid in multiples, builders guaranteed their work with their lives when negligence killed, sorcerers met penalties slid between law and fear, false accusers paid the price intended for their victims. Some offenses wore public humiliation, stocks at the gate, scoldings under a lean spear, a parade of shame measured in streets, others drew exile, the empire's slow knife. But restitution lived alongside retribution, silver returned, fields restored, hands shaken under witnesses whose names mattered more than faces. Household gods were heavy with fingerprints. A terracotta Pazuzu, demon against demons, hung in a midwife's room. A small amulet of Lamashtu warned a nightmare to mind its manners, clay dogs stood in foundations to bite what the night forgot to. These were not contradictions to high religion, they were its vernacular. If the city had oxygen, it was made of small protections exercised daily with seriousness and a joke. The army was a place in society, not only an instrument beyond it. In Assyria, campaign season reconfigured families, sons marched, fathers dredged, mothers took ledgers out of baskets, sisters wrote letters with careful hands. Rank brought pay and rations, wounds brought petitions for relief, veterans sat at gates and taught boys to be brave with friends instead of alone. In Babylonia, warfare often looked like diplomacy by other means. Garrisons mattered less than governors, oaths mattered more than awed rams, until they didn't. Either way, the community adjusted itself around the crown's appetite. Scholars were both archivists and tinkerers. Astronomers turned priestly attention into ephemerides, physicians turned omen habit into diagnosis, lexicographers turned multilingual streets into dictionaries, jurists turned custom into clause. Error was noted, corrected, recopied. Pride lived in footnotes as well as in palaces. A city that corrects itself lasts. Finally, status had a humility ritual built in. In Babylon, the slap at New Year kept arrogance from making policy lonely. In Assyria, oracles and succession treaties bound power to promises before witnesses mortal and divine. Even Lamassu, those serene bulls with human calm, stood as reminders that what looks immovable is actually guardianship exercised minute by minute. Society remained upright because it rehearsed uprightness. When rehearsal failed, collapse was fast. Take a day and walk it, terrace by terrace. Dawn in a weaver's court, warp stretched, a child counting to 60 because that is how the teacher said to count. Mid-morning in a temple office, grain entered, receipts sealed, a singer practicing a lament in a side room. Noon in a market, silver weighed, dispute scheduled. Afternoon in a court, envelopes cracked, witnesses named. Dusk on a roof, family eating, stars recited. Night in a garrison, orders opened, horses checked. Between each hour, small prayers and smaller jokes. Between each class, a little envy and much imitation. Between north and south, a game of copying and contradicting that made both sharper. This was how the ziggurat of society held its shape, base broad, middle strong, summit windy but watched. Law was clay, faith was schedule, family was contract and tenderness, rank was textile and duty, knowledge was copied until it behaved. If the rivers were the country's veins, society was its posture. It stood upright most days. It bowed when required. It carried weight. War in Mesopotamia was not a frenzy, it was a calendar. The year's hinge months taught kings what verbs to favor, march, Levi, besiege, rebuild, and the state rehearsed those verbs until they sounded like liturgy. In Assyria the drumbeat was professional, in Babylonia the drumbeat was juridical, in both, the tempo was logistics. Assyria engineered movement. By the 9th to 7th centuries BCE, a permanent corps, royal guard, archers, lancers, slingers, chariot crews and, increasingly, cavalry, stayed sharp through winter. Spring omens cleared, quotas were read, depots at regular day marches were stocked, leather water sacks, nails for rams, spare bowstrings, barley for men and beasts, everything counted twice. Bronze yielded to iron, composite bows made safer distances unsafe, scale armor flashed like fish when the line turned. Siegecraft graduated from daring to doctrine, earthen ramps poured up wall faces, sappers gnawed foundations under wet hides, battering rams on wheeled frames kissed gates in a rhythm as patient as arithmetic, towers rolled forward with squared windows for archers. When the gate broke, it was not only courage that did it. It was math. Kings narrated this machinery with thunder and totals. Ashurnasirpal II, 883 to 859 BCE, reopened arteries from the Zagros to the Mediterranean, washing weapons in salt as much for the ceremony as for the salt. He then fed 40-odd thousand guests at Kalhu to inaugurate his rebuilt capital, a banquet that turned abundance into political theatre. Shalmaneser III, 858 to 824, carved his black obelisk with tribute scenes, most famously a kneeling king from Israel, because images can travel where garrisons cannot. At Karkar, 853 BCE, he met a Levantine coalition, Damascus, Hamath, Israel, and Arab chariotry among others. The field did not yield a clean Assyrian victory, but the coalition learned how regular Assyrian momentum felt. Later annals read like invoices, how many chariots dismantled and shipped, how many towns counted among the cities of Assyria, how many talents of silver, how many horses taken and redistributed into the army's appetite. Tiglath-Pileser III, 745 to 727, reformed the empire into a machine that could be repaired while running. He provincialized client kingdoms into smaller, governable units, he standardized tribute, he made deportation a system, cruel, yes, but also horticultural in intent, moving tens of thousands to break coalitions and plant skills where taxes needed them. By Sargon II's time, 722 to 705, Samaria had fallen, 722, Israel's elites had learned other riverbanks, governors knew that a post rider carried not only orders but also the audit of their future. Sennacherib, 705 to 681, put the doctrine on display. In 701 he crushed Lachish in Judah, reliefs at Nineveh show ramps, ladders, families in controlled exile, then shut up Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a caged bird. The city did not fall. Memory preserves two versions, one of miracle, one of plague, in which Assyria's arithmetic met an equation it did not like. But the point was made elsewhere along the Levant: tribute is cheaper than smoke. Assyria's rhetoric of terror, impalement, flaying, pyramids of heads, was punctuation, not prose. Between the grisly lines ran the real text: provinces that delivered harvests and soldiers, roads with relays, inspectors whose title, the king's eye, wandered in without warning, royal correspondence that moved fast enough to matter. Esarhaddon, 681 to 669, did what his fathers had threatened and marched into Egypt in 671, taking Memphis. He installed governors and treaties and then suffered the reality that Egypt prefers itself. Ashurbanipal, 669 c. 631, reduced Elam brick by brick, 653 to 646, imported its gods, claimed literacy as a royal virtue, and watched his generals write him letters full of cities, weights, and weather. After him, knives multiplied in corridors. Magnates remembered their grandfathers' surnames. The machine ran, but its mechanic had left the workshop. Babylonia practiced a different grammar of power. Hammurabi, R.C. 1792 to 1750 BCE, is remembered for his law stele, but his conquests were diplomatic before they were martial, alliances made and unmade with a priest's ear and an engineer's eye. He cut canals that served barley and boots, placed judges where friction was profitable, struck when rivals were winded. The stele's prologue shows a god handing him rod and ring, the clauses show him fining sloppy builders and regulating orchard leases. The message to the conquered was clear: we do not merely own you, we will administrate you into predictability. A millennium later, the Neo-Babylonians won by timing. Nabopolassar, 626 to 605, a Chaldean general with Babylonian ambitions, watched Assyria, hollowed by civil war, try to stand. He allied with the Medes. In 612 BCE, Nineveh's cedar bones cracked, fire ran roofline to archive, Lamassu took on darkness they could not control. Haran fell in 609, Assyria's name survived mostly as a metaphor. Nebuchadnezzar II, 605 to 562, arrived like a surveyor with an army. At Carchemish, 605 BCE, he severed Egyptian reach into Syria. The Levant buckled, Judah yielded, then tested the math again. Jerusalem fell finally in 587 or 586 BCE. Elites walked east into a captivity that would become literature. A second temple would one day rise on the memory of a first. Tyre endured a siege measured in years, traditions count 13. Babylon preferred patience at sea, the slow tightening of a ring, over spectacle. When the city negotiated, it sounded less like defeat than like arithmetic learned late. Nebuchadnezzar's domestic politics wore brick like medals. He squared Babylon, moats fed by the Euphrates, double and triple walls, the processional way with its enamel lions, the Ishtar gate blue as healed sky, temple restoration stamped with his name in numbers that turn modern curators pale. His inscriptions boast more of rebuilding than of slaughter. He styled himself as restorer, the one who made firm the foundations of the land. Festivals were propaganda, the act to renewing a contract between heaven and the city, the king taking Marduk's hand, devout and useful at once. Priests approved. Ledgers tallied. Legitimacy marched in files of bricks. Opponents made the empires smarter. Urartu in the Armenian highlands rolled boulders onto Assyrian ramps and, for a century, held lakes and fortresses by altitude and stubbornness. Aramean states flickered along the Euphrates, good at melting and reforming, better at exporting their language than their borders. Elam to the east was a recurring problem and prize, smart, close, rich, its capture enriched both Assyrians and Babylonians, its resilience humbled both. Phoenician cities bought time with purple and cedar. When they gambled on rebellion, they paid in hostages and harbor chains. Arabs, Kedarites and others, threaded deserts with camels that turned dunes into avenues. Assyrian annals list queens of the tents as formidable policy actors. Cimmerians and Scythians, steppe thunder, brushed the northern frontiers, teaching the settled to respect speed. Treaties wore theology like chain mail. Esarhaddon's succession treaty bound magnates with curses piled as high as a ziggurat, betray the heir and may your seed be salted, your house a proverb, your God deaf. Vassal oaths in the West read like spells against forgetfulness. You will not listen to sedition, you will not welcome envoys without telling the king, you will not, pages of prophylaxis. Babylonia preferred law where Assyria preferred oath, but both made promises a matter of public ritual. When kings changed, copies of treaties were recopied, witnesses named again, curses refreshed like paint. Oracles and omens stitched the political to the divine. Assyrian kings asked Ishtar of Arbela very specific questions: shall I attack the city of X this month? And received very specific approvals. Eclipses could pause campaigns, substitute kings soaked predicted ruin while the real king hid in ritual time, then re-emerged when the sky calmed. Babylon's priests read the sky with a bureaucrat's patience. Omen series like Enma Anu Enlil filed precedents that mixed or with data. A bad sign could be met with a ritual, a substitution, a delay, policy with incense. Intelligence mattered as much as iron. Assyria's relay system, post stations with fresh horses, moved letters faster than rumor. Reports from provincial offices often sound like eternal memos, barley short, shields returned with soft rivets, the local strongman is friendly until drunk, snow delayed the tin, the ford is higher than last year. Replies are exact: send an extra allotment, reforge the shields, invite the strongman to hunt, do not mention tribute at the hunt, replace the ford's overseer, pray at this shrine on this day and then proceed. These paragraphs never make the triumphal reliefs. They are the empire's heartbeat. The economy of conquest followed rules the market understood. War paid for itself where it could: booty, tribute, new fields assigned under Ilku service, but it also cost: warehouses stocked, wages met, tools made. Deportation created labor where the crown wanted it and dried labor where rebellion had festered. A province left underpopulated was a province left dangerous. Babylonia's credit houses, Egibai and others, financed long sieges with leases and loans. Silver flowed from temple chests into campaigns and back into restorations. When a war did not pay, ideologues worked harder, God's honor affronted, rebels insulting the order of the world, kings performing the repair of creation with rams and ramps. Diplomacy could be as lethal as a ram's head. Letters to Egypt and Anatolia before the late Bronze Crash call kings brother, trading sisters as wives and gold as gifts, because equality was cheaper than the word vassal. After the crash, Assyria dealt less in brotherhood than in schooled obedience. Babylonia, during Kassite calm and later Chaldean ascent, returned to politer tones. Both understood a fact that still walks today: a letter that arrives in time can spare a city a siege. Voices from the ground show politics from below. A soldier petitions for his back pay after a wound, a deported potter requests clay near water and is granted it, a town scribe warns his superior that the tax farmer is skimming, a widow asks that her grain allotment be restored because her son died in service. Decisions come back with seals. Some say yes. Some say wait until the harvest. Some say nothing at all. The system's justice is uneven, but its habit of writing everything down gives us, later, a way to measure the unevenness rather than guess at it. Egypt provided both temptation and warning. Assyria entered, forced it to nod, and learned how quickly the Nile erases footprints. Babylon glanced, calculated, and decided that controlling Syria was profit enough. Meanwhile, smaller kingdoms, Judah, Ammon, Moab, Edom, navigated between large calendars. Some bet on Egypt and lost, Judah twice, some paid quietly and farmed well, some revolted on the rumor of a succession crisis in Nineveh and discovered that rumors were cheaper than armies. When Babylon met Persia, the playbook changed register. Nabonidus, 556 to 539 BCE, alienated Marduk's clergy by exalting Sin, the moon god, and by spending long seasons in Timur in northern Arabia, he left the impression, fair or not, of piety at odds with civic rhythm. Cyrus II, the Great, arrived holding a new kind of legitimacy, rich, efficient, and fond of portraying conquest as restoration. In 539 BCE, after a field victory near Opis, Sippar yielded without a fight. Babylon opened rather than burned. Later tradition imagines the Euphrates diverted and a night march through a lowered riverbed. Contemporary tablets speak more of doors and surrender. Cyrus' policy document, the famous cylinder, framed his victory as the god Marduk's choice and promised to return sanctuaries to their gods and peoples to their homes. It was old Mesopotamian propaganda played in a new key, the conqueror as restorer of ritual schedules. Assyria did not meet such a soft landing. After Ashurbanipal, internal fractures, overextension, and coordinated enemies, Medes and Babylonians, collapsed the northern edifice in a handful of terrifying years. 612 BCE burned Nineveh into a preservation kill, 609 removed Haran, remnants fled west and vanished into other people's archives. Yet roads and habits outlived banners. Provinces became satrapies with longer leashes. Relays carried Aramaic letters stamped with Persian authority. Deportees, settled decades before, watered new loyalties. Tactics had rhetoric, and rhetoric had tactics. Assyrian annals prefer verbs that stack, I captured, I destroyed, I carried off, and numbers that audit. Babylonian inscriptions prefer verbs that sustain, I restored, I strengthened, I returned, and bricks that speak. Both could be tender or ruthless as policy demanded. When it suited, Assyrian kings rebuilt enemy temples with their names on the foundation stones. When it suited, Babylonian kings marched rams to teach patience to a sea city. Between sword and seal, both learned that fear and fairness, alternated with rhythm, make obedience efficient. The moral weather inside empires always changes slower than the banners. Assyria taught the Near East to think in provinces and roads. Babylonia taught it to think in calendars and clauses. Each sharpened the other. The South adopted the North's deportations when humane arithmetic preferred movement to massacre. The North endowed temples and staged festivals with the South sense that law is pageant as much as penalty. They watched, copied, contradicted, and, over centuries, produced a common imperial culture that Persians, Greeks, and Romans would inherit, survey, subdivide, schedule, standardize, then celebrate order publicly so that subjects recognize themselves in it. In the end, campaigns become place names in school books. Karkar, Lachish, Karshemish, Opis, and palaces become museum rooms, lion hunts walking on gypsum, blue bricks assembled under cool lights far from the heat that birthed them. But the political inventions remain lively, a government with relays, a tax tied to land and service, treaties that bind by fear and habit, an archive that can embarrass a governor 3 provinces away. When later rulers grasp a god's hand, step onto a processional way, or issue a decree that makes conquest sound like repair, they are speaking the old language of the rivers. Empires fall like tents after a festival. Pegs pulled, ropes coiled, footprints in dust. What remains are the habits that tents taught: how to tie a knot so it releases when you mean it and not before, how to set poles against wind, how to make a temporary thing behave like a promise. Babylon and Assyria dismantled into neighbors and provinces, into satrapies and kingdoms, and then into classrooms and museums. Their habits kept walking. Begin with time, the most imperial invention because it conquers everyone. Sexagesimal mathematics settled into humanity like a second spine. 60 made division easy and memory faithful. The circle consented to 360, the hour learned to be 60 minutes and the minute 60 seconds, right angles became 90 as if that had always been their name. A Babylonian scribe, tired from copying tables under a hot lamp, would recognize your clock with the relieved nod of a craftsman seeing his old tool still fit the hand. Astronomers, first priests on rooftops, later Greeks in island observatories, later Arabs under domes of geometry, took ephemerides copied in temple schools and turned them into predictions that could embarrass a king if he pretended the sky was a whim. The zodiac, that civic calendar of stars, marched west under changed gods, but with the same stubborn belief that the future, like the flood, could be scheduled. Law outlives the lawgivers because fairness is a shape that repeats. Hammurabi's black stele, once a piece of temple furniture, now a celebrity of stone, speaks a language every court since has tried to imitate: proportional penalty, published rules, tenderness where life is fragile, hardness where fraud fattens. Even where no code copied it directly, the idea that justice should stand in a square and declare itself became the civic religion of later cities. Kassite Kuduru stones, with their divine emblems carved across a deed, taught a simple lesson dressed in basalt: property is not only fence but memory, pledge it before gods you both fear. The habit of witnessing, names listed, seals impressed, duplicates filed, made the city a place where memory outranked muscle at least one afternoon out of 2. Administration is a dynasty without heirs, it survives by being useful. Assyria's invention of the province, surveyed, taxed, patrolled, relayed, gave Persia a skeleton to flesh with longer leashes, gave Rome a cousin to brag to and borrow from, gave any future state a checklist: roads, with stations, inspectors, with teeth, archives, with elbows, and a reliable calendar for harvests and campaigns. Deportation, brutal and efficient, planted skills across the Near East and, unintentionally, created diasporas that taught peoples how to endure without a throne. Distant from their old flags, communities learned to conjugate identity in the future tense: we will remember, we will keep this feast, we will name our children with names that taste of river water and lamp oil. A policy meant to erase lines drew others darker. Language traveled in 2 modes, as library and as letter. Akkadian, thick with clay and liturgy, became the classic that scholars loved long after markets stopped using it, Sumerian even more so, surviving as a learned tongue the way Latin would later haunt cathedrals. Aramaic, the brisk script that fit on skin and papyrus, learned office hours under the Persians and served empires until other scripts took the job. Through that envelope, orders, prayers, and prices moved, under that envelope, memories grappled. When Greek came with a sword and a school, it took the libraries more than the ledgers. Hellenistic astronomers copied Babylonian tables, philosophers, even while sneering at Chaldeans, learned to respect a civilization that had turned the sky into an appointment book. Later, Arabic in the House of Wisdom at Baghdad reopened the drawers and found Babylonian habits in the tools, classification, commentary, compilation, clay instincts in parchment clothes. Literature broke its jar and perfumed neighboring rooms. Gilgamesh, pressed into Ashurbanipal's shelves and then into modern mouths, stepped from clay to paper to screen without losing the ache at his center. We love, we lose, we seek meaning where the gods have hidden it in labor, friendship, and the dignity of limits. Flood stories swam from Akkadian into Hebrew and Greek, wisdom dialogues, complaints answered with skill rather than slogans, prefigured arguments that later scriptures would take up and refine. Even the way later traditions dated visions, in the nth year of King so-and-so, in the nth month, owe something to a people for whom revelation was not respectable until it was filed. Religion carried their names as both root and metaphor. Marduk became Bel to foreign ears, Ishtar's splendor crossfaded into Aphrodite's charms and Astarte's politics, Nabu's love of the stylus became reverence for literacy itself, Shamash, square as law and blinding as noon, helped set the moral color of sunlight. At the same time, Babylon became a useful villain in other people's stories, prideful city, confusing tongues, decadent court, an insult that admits influence by pretending to scorn it. Nineveh became the city that can repent for a breath and then forget. These metaphors allowed later cultures to talk about their own anxieties, empire and exile, pride and penitence, using Mesopotamian silhouettes. Gardens and gates became myths that architecture still envies. The Hanging Gardens, whether terraced at Nineveh by Sennacherib's stubborn hydraulics or at Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar's domestic diplomacy, rose in later imaginations as humanity's defiance of heat, a green stairway in a place that needed shade like lungs need air. The Ishtar Gate, reassembled in cool northern halls, continues to slow steps and raise chins the way it did in its original sun. Lions and bulls, enamel and brick, demonstrate a lesson every capital tries to learn: beauty is not a luxury, it is part of how power asks to be obeyed without being hated. Museums learn to speak cuneiform with their walls. When 19th-century Picts pulled Lamassu from the earth and shipped them under grey skies, London and Paris and New York met Assyria's self-portrait, the king poised against lion, the ram against gate, rivers as catalogues of fish and reed, gardens as inventories of exotic trees. Alongside the stone, the script yielded Grotefen's guesses, Rawlinson's cliffside bravado, and a small choir of scholars turned wedges into syllables and then into voices. Clark voices and Queen voices, booming annals and whispered loans, jokes and hymns, a widow's clause and a general's weather report. Modernity, dressed in certainty, discovered it had ancestors in the habit of keeping receipts. Commerce remembered the gestures long after materials changed. Cylinder seals, tiny epics rolled onto clay, taught signatures to be narratives. Modern logos, hung above doors and splashed across devices, are their distant, shallow cousins. The scale, the honest weight, remained the altar of fair dealing even after coins replaced weighed silver. Interest rates debated in temple courts found their way into later sermons and civil codes. Debt jubilees glimmered at the edge of political imagination whenever economies needed mercy to survive their own arithmetic. A Babylonian house of Egibai would recognize the paperwork of a modern bank: collateral, term, penalty, witness, seal, only the medium is different, and not always as durable. Architecture kept the memory of staged ascent. Ziggurats taught cities that monuments could be mountains if the land would not provide one. Processional avenues taught capitals to align streets with ritual. Double walls taught them that defense is both engineering and theater. Assyrian palaces, with reliefs as newspapers and courtyards as public statements, modeled how power narrates itself in stone. Cornerstones with royal names are the late, modest echo of bricks stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's square certainty. Science separated from divination the way siblings do, by stealing tools and moving out. Omen series trained generations to classify relentlessly. Astronomers reproposed that discipline into tables no longer addressed to gods. Medical recipes, stitched to incantations in early tablets, bequeathed a habit of observing symptoms closely and recording results publicly. When later physicians wrote case histories and later astronomers graphed errors, they were improving tools first forged in tablet houses. The rational is not born from nothing, it grows like a careful weed in fields first fenced by ritual. Memory recoalesced as scripture in exile. In 587–586 BCE, when Jerusalem's temple sank into fire and elites walked east under Assyrian invented, Babylonian perfected policy, a literature that would teach the world learn to think in terms of covenant and calendar. Rivers of Babylon became both place and metaphor. Psalm and lament learned the Mesopotamian arts of dating and filing and then sang against them. When they returned and rebuilt, the habits of exile, portable ritual, textual identity, historical conscience, did not vanish, they multiplied. An empire's cruelty became a people's curriculum. Languages receded and surged like seasonal water. Sumerian declined into scholarship and charm, Akkadian receded to academies, Aramaic became the courier of policy, Greek opened libraries and exported argument. Later, Arabic assembled a cosmopolitan house where Sanskrit, Greek, Persian, and the clay memory of Mesopotamia were introduced, argued, and married. Yet under every alphabet you can still feel the old bureaucracy, the urge to list, to compare copies, to correct margins, to footnote the past into a tool. The land holds what the text forgets. Satellite images trace dead canals faint as veins in an old hand, mounds the color of baked bread rise where walls once held processions, potsherds glitter where courtyards breathed evening, collapsed ziggurats stand like paragraphs whose first lines you can still read. Marshes remain arguers with drought, the two rivers keep their personalities, Tigris quick and stern, Euphrates patient and sly. Every so often a farmer's plough lifts a tablet, and a widow's name interrupts a modern afternoon with her old, precise complaint. The shadow bequest is real. Empire as habit. Provinces as rectangles. Deportation as cure for defiance. Roads as instruments of control as much as of exchange. Reports that never forget to copy themselves. A faith that terror, applied with a schedule, is cheaper than justice, and a counter-faith that law, applied with spectacle, can make power seem kind. These ideas are as exportable as textiles, they require perpetual interrogation lest we call them inevitable. When a government brags about roads while quieting the people who walk them, when it holds festivals to renew legitimacy while neglecting the levees, when it counts more precisely than it remembers, these are old sins with new stationery. Yet the tender bequest is as stubborn. A contract that protects a widow, an adoption deed that promises burial and grief, a festival that humiliates a king for the common safety, a library that survives fire by planning to burn, a school that teaches children to count stars as if they were sheep, a city that keeps the names of its dead scheduled, poured with beer and remembered aloud. These, too, are Mesopotamian. These, too, are modern. Stand in a museum under a winged bull. You feel your breath change, not because the stone is heavy, though it is, but because the idea is heavy, that security is the right kind of watchfulness multiplied by years, that grace can be part of guard, that a gate is a promise as much as a defense. Walk past blue bricks, their glaze still cool as evening water, and let your steps slow. You are practicing an old civic virtue, or before deliberate order. Step outside into a city of buses and glass, check your phone's clock, 60 smiling in quiet victory, and turn a corner onto a processional way whose festival is traffic. Everything important about the old world is still happening, only with different verbs. If you want an ending, take this one at dusk. The Tigris and Euphrates lie long and silver, each with its temper. A shepherd calls ribs and wool toward a corral. On a ruined terrace, a child with dust on his knees picks a potsherd and holds it to the sun as if it were a mirror. Somewhere a muezzin threads evening with his voice, somewhere a church bell counts, somewhere a scholar scrolls through a scan of a tablet and stares at a wedge that might be field or fault, and the decision will shift a footnote and a thesis and, in a small way, the world. Date palms rattle their dry applause. Warm wind smells of bitumen and sesame. High in whitening sky a planet scratches its patient path, on schedule, as promised, as counted in a school that no longer stands. The rivers move. The story keeps the pace they set. Babylonians and Assyrians are gone and present, burned cities, baked archives, broken gates, unbroken hours. Their gods are museum labels and living metaphors, their kings are chipped noses and paragraphs in books, their ordinary people are fingerprints in brick and habits in us. Between flood and drought, between decree and festival, they taught the earth how to be organized and the sky how to be read. That is legacy enough for any empire. That is more than most.